Welcome to another round of NDIS Business Advisory Series. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Dev.
Today we are trying to talk a bit more on the financial viability in the sector, and that's been seen for the last few years. Regularly, the providers are facing a challenge to see what's happening in the space, and in terms of the operating environment is being challenging. And what do you feel about that?
Dev, I think that the NDIS sector is reflecting what's happening in the country more broadly. They're pretty similar in terms of the percentages of how that people feel that the economic situation has worsened of late. And I think when we look at the NDIS sector, and if we looked at the NDIS sector report that went out the end of last year, I think it was, the percentage of the respondents to that had actually made a loss, that's 46% had made a profit. So you've got a very large percentage of organisations not making a profit. So 23% made a loss. But then you've also got 28% who broke even or were close to it. So I think that as a sector, as a business, as organisations, I think it's quite a worry, and that organisations can't carry on making those losses.
And which is almost half of the organizations, half of the NDIS providers. If you want to scale it up and extrapolate that number to the whole sector, half of the organizations who are delivering services, they either break even or make a loss, which might be coming out of from their balance sheets, which might be coming out of the reserves they have accumulated across the years. And probably the bigger challenge is the operating structure they are using or they are working on are not very financially viable or not aligned with the NDIA cost model assumptions, because NDIA cost model assumptions have specific assumptions on the operating margins, on the corporate overheads, and on the support worker wages, and there are a few other things there. So they do not match the expectation, and whereas the pricing is set up using the NDIA cost model and the price benchmarking, and hence probably there are higher corporate overheads in the organizations of larger sizes, and that probably pushing towards bad financial viability.
I think you're right, Dev. The whole financial elements of running a business like the NDIA, the lack of control over your costing and pricing. You are restricted to being able to charge a certain amount. So that can be an enormous challenge when you're running an organisation, and especially when some of the costs are costs that are out of your control or that are not really being covered within the pricing structure that the NDIA has set up. If you start thinking about compliance, and I'm sure we'll talk about that at another time, but those costs are the sorts of costs that organisations are having to bear, and they're not necessarily being accounted for within the pricing that the NDIA is setting up.
I think you're very much right, Rob, on that one, is that the extra added labor cost, you may call it, on the compliance to deliver the compliance. And when the frontline care workers are focusing on, they should be focusing on delivery of care rather than evidencing what they are delivering. So they have to do the right amount of evidencing. But if there is a percentage of the time being spent instead of delivery of care versus evidencing of what they have done, because it's relevant and it's important to evidence what they have delivered, and there is a bare minimum requirement to be done, but that leads into the extra cost burden.
Yes, and I think if we've got workforce shortages, then we're having to compete to try and attract staff. So there's a cost pressure point there, and especially if you started looking in the allied health area, that you are competing with the for-profit areas. People are able to charge more, whereas you can't do that in the NDIS.
And that's when a bigger question needs to be asked from every provider: that do they become a specialist if they are an allied health provider, to stay in allied health, or they become a generalist so that they can deliver multiple services, so that they can provide a whole suite of services, so that the top line grows, so they can pick up a lot of slack of extra costs covered through compliance and all of that. So that's a bigger question to ask, whether they become a specialist versus a generalist.
That's the $60 million sort of like proposal. It's really organisations looking at, yes, what do they want to provide, but they're having to really, mind you, it's the same with any business, having to really look at their costings. What is it that they're doing? What is the cost associated with that? And are they getting the income in to be able to sustain it? And I think it's really interesting to look at how different organisations are approaching this particular challenge.
And we have the only what we do is we try to benchmark our financials, our operating margins, our corporate overheads, our labor cost, direct labor, indirect labor, so that we can see as an organisation where we are sitting, and then have multiple cost centres and profit centres. And allocation of cost should be right. I think we can talk this topic to the length, and then we can go in that rabbit hole of financial viability. But thanks, Rob, for the conversation today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks, Dave.